The scream tore through the hall before the doors even finished opening. Lyra Ashford stumbled forward, pushed by a guard who did not care whether she fell. She caught herself on the edge of a stone pillar, her knees shaking, her breath coming in short, ragged bursts. Hundreds of eyes turned to look at her. Not one of them looked kind. At the far end of the hall, seated on a throne carved from black wood and iron, sat Draven Blackthorn, the Alpha King. He did not stand. He did not smile. He simply stared at her the way a man might stare at a stray dog that had wandered into his home uninvited. "This is her?" he asked, his voice low and flat, carrying easily across the silent hall. "This is the bride the council sends me?" Nobody answered him. Nobody needed to. The answer was standing right in front of him, trembling in a plain gray dress that had been chosen for her by strangers, in a body that felt too small, too fragile, too human, for the world she had just been thrown into. Lyra lifted her chin. She would not let them see her cry. Not here. Not in front of all these wolves who already thought so little of her. "I am Lyra Ashford," she said, and her voice, though quiet, did not shake. "I was sent here to honor the alliance between our packs." Draven rose from his throne then, slow and deliberate, like a predator that did not need to rush because it already knew it had won. He walked down the steps toward her, and with every step, the wolves around her seemed to hold their breath. He stopped only a few feet away, close enough that she could feel the raw power radiating off him, a power that made the hair on her arms stand on end. He looked her over from head to toe, the way a merchant might examine a horse before deciding not to buy it. "You're thin," he said. "You're pale. I don't smell a single trace of wolf on you." He turned to the crowd, spreading his arms as if inviting them to share in the joke. "The council sends me a wolfless girl and calls it an honor." Laughter rippled through the hall. Not everyone laughed, but enough did, and the sound of it settled into Lyra's chest like a stone dropped into still water. She had known this would not be easy. She had not known it would be this cruel. "I may not look like what you expected," she said, forcing the words out steady and clear, "but I am still the daughter of my pack, and I came here in good faith." Draven's eyes narrowed slightly, as if her steadiness surprised him. But he recovered quickly, and his mouth curved into something that was not quite a smile. "Good faith won't win a war," he said. "Good faith won't stand at my side when Duskmoon wolves come across the border. I need a mate who can fight beside me, not one who needs to be protected." He turned away from her, already dismissing her from his thoughts. "Take her to the servants' quarters. She'll room with the staff." A murmur went through the hall, surprise mixed with something like satisfaction, as if the crowd enjoyed watching someone be put in her place. Lyra felt her face burn, but she did not look down. She would not give them the satisfaction of watching her break. A young woman with dark hair and tired eyes stepped forward from the edge of the hall. Her name, Lyra would later learn, was Grace, and she was one of the pack's healers in training. Grace did not smile at her, but she did not sneer either. And in that moment, the absence of cruelty felt like a kindness. "This way," Grace said quietly, and Lyra followed her out of the hall, away from the whispers and the laughter, down a narrow corridor, lit by torches, that flickered against damp stone walls. Neither of them spoke until they were well away from the throne room. Then Grace glanced sideways at her, curiosity flickering behind her caution. "You didn't cry," Grace said. "Most people would have." "Crying wouldn't have changed anything," Lyra answered. "It would only have given him more reason to think less of me." Grace considered this for a moment, then gave a small nod, as if filing the observation away for later. "The servants' quarters aren't much," she said. "But nobody will bother you there. Most people keep to themselves." The servants' quarters, as it turned out, were a narrow room at the back of the compound, with a single cot, a chipped basin for washing, and a small window that let in a sliver of gray light. It was nothing like the chambers a mate of the Alpha King should have had. But Lyra did not complain. She had learned long ago that complaining rarely changed anything, and that silence often protected you better than words ever could. She sat on the edge of the cot after Grace left, and for the first time since arriving, she allowed herself to feel the full weight of what had just happened. She had been sent here as a bridge between two packs, a peace offering wrapped in human skin, and within minutes of arriving, she had been humiliated in front of an entire kingdom. And yet, beneath the humiliation, beneath the sting of his words, something else stirred. A strange, cold sensation deep beneath her skin, like frost creeping across a window pane. It had happened before, in small flashes she never understood. A tingling in her fingertips when she was frightened. A strange pull behind her eyes when she was angry. She had always pushed it down, telling herself it was nerves, imagination, nothing more. But sitting there in that narrow room, after being mocked in front of hundreds of strangers, the sensation was stronger than she had ever felt it before. It curled through her chest like something waking from a long sleep, something ancient and patient, something that had been waiting for the right moment to open its eyes. Lyra pressed a hand to her chest and took a slow breath, willing the strange feeling to settle. She did not know what it meant. She only knew that she could not let anyone see it, not yet, not until she understood it herself. Outside her small window, the sun began to set over the Blackthorn territory, painting the sky in shades of orange and violet. Somewhere beyond the walls, wolves howled to greet the coming night, their voices rising and falling in a chorus that should have felt threatening, but instead felt oddly comforting, like a lullaby sung in a language she had not yet learned to understand. She thought of her family, far away in her home pack, and wondered if they knew what kind of welcome she had received. She thought of the treaty that had brought her here, the fragile peace between two packs that depended, in some small way, on her ability to survive in this place. And she thought of Draven Blackthorn, with his cold eyes and colder words, and the way he had looked at her, as though she were something to be discarded, rather than someone to be known. She did not sleep well that night. The cot was hard, the room was cold, and every time she closed her eyes, she heard the sound of laughter echoing through the throne room, saw the curl of Draven's lip as he called her weak in front of his entire pack. But somewhere in the depths of that long night, beneath the hurt and the humiliation, a quiet resolve began to form. She would not let them define her. She would not let his mockery become her truth. She did not yet know what the strange power inside her meant, but she knew, with a certainty she could not explain, that she was not as weak as they believed her to be. Morning came slowly, gray light creeping through the small window and settling over the narrow room like a blanket. Lyra rose before the rest of the compound stirred, splashing cold water on her face from the chipped basin, trying to wash away the exhaustion of a sleepless night. She had barely finished dressing when a sharp knock rattled her door. Before she could answer, it swung open, and a broad-shouldered man with sharp eyes and an unreadable expression stepped inside. He wore the Blackthorn crest on his shoulder, marking him as one of the pack's ranking wolves. "I'm Kane," he said, his voice carrying the same clipped authority she had heard in Draven's tone the night before, though softer around the edges. "Beta of this pack. The Alpha wants you to understand the rules of this house before you cause any trouble." "I have no intention of causing trouble," Lyra said evenly. Kane studied her for a long moment, his sharp eyes flicking over her the way a soldier might assess a potential threat, deciding whether it was worth taking seriously. Whatever he saw did not seem to impress him. "Good," he said. "Then you'll stay out of the Alpha's way, keep to the servants' quarters, and not embarrass this pack any further than you already have." The words stung, but Lyra had expected nothing less. She simply nodded, refusing to give him the satisfaction of a reaction. Kane turned to leave, then paused at the door, glancing back at her with something that might have been curiosity, though it was gone as quickly as it appeared. "For what it's worth," he said, "most people who get treated like that on their first night don't stay quiet about it. You did." He did not explain what he meant by the observation, and before Lyra could ask, he was gone, leaving her alone once more. The days that followed fell into a pattern of quiet endurance. Lyra rose early each morning and worked alongside the other servants, scrubbing floors, hauling water, mending torn linens, anything that needed doing. She did not complain, and slowly, the other servants began to notice her steady hands and her willingness to work without being asked twice. Grace, the healer in training who had first led her to the servants' quarters, became something close to a friend, though neither of them spoke the word aloud. In the evenings, after the work was done, Grace would sometimes sit with her near the kitchen fire, sharing quiet observations about the pack, the politics that moved beneath its surface, the fragile balance of power that kept everyone in their place. "You're not what they expected," Grace said one evening, watching the flames dance in the hearth. "The others thought you'd cry, and begged to be sent home within a week. You haven't done either." Would crying have changed anything? Lyra asked. No, Grace admitted, but most people cry anyway. Lyra thought about that for a long moment. I don't have the luxury of falling apart, she said quietly. If I do, they'll use it as proof that I never belonged here in the first place. Grace glanced at her with an expression that was difficult to read, somewhere between admiration and pity. You really believe you belong here? I don't know, Lyra admitted, but I know I'm not leaving just because they want me to. It was around this time that Lyra first noticed the whispers following her through the compound. Pack members who had never spoken a word to her began to watch her more closely, their eyes narrowing whenever she passed, as though trying to solve a puzzle they could not quite piece together. She heard fragments of conversation not meant for her ears, words like wolfless and empty and cursed, spoken in tones that ranged from pity to disgust. She learned, slowly, what it meant to be considered wolfless in a pack like this. Every shifter was expected to transform at some point in their youth, to reveal the wolf that lived beneath their human skin. Those who never shifted were considered incomplete, broken in some fundamental way, unworthy of full standing within pack society. The whispers suggested that this was Lyra's fate, that she had been sent to Blackthorn not as an honor, but as a burden nobody else wanted to bear. She never confirmed or denied the rumors. She did not know herself whether they were true. She had never shifted, not once in her entire life, despite every attempt her family had made to help her along. But she also knew, with a quiet certainty she could not explain, that the strange, cold sensation stirring beneath her skin was not nothing. It was something waiting, something patient, something that had not yet decided to reveal itself. One afternoon, while carrying a basket of linens across the courtyard, Lyra passed close enough to overhear two pack members discussing her in low voices, clearly believing themselves unheard. She flinches at everything, one of them said, a broad-shouldered man named Edwin, who worked in the pack's kennels. Jumped a mile when a dog barked near her yesterday. That's not a wolf's reaction, that's a rabbit's. Maybe the alpha was right, the other replied, a woman Lyra did not recognize. Maybe she really is wolfless. Be a shame if the whole alliance falls apart because the council sent us a girl with no wolf inside her. Lyra kept walking, refusing to let her steps falter, though the words settled into her chest like small, sharp stones. She told herself it did not matter what they thought. She told herself their opinions had no bearing on who she truly was. But some nights, lying awake in the narrow cot, she wondered if they might be right. She wondered if the strange sensation she felt was nothing more than nerves and imagination, a trick her mind played to comfort her in moments of fear. It was during one such sleepless night, nearly 2 weeks after her arrival, that she first spoke with Mabel. She had gone to the healer's quarters, seeking a remedy for a persistent headache that had plagued her for days, brought on, she assumed, by exhaustion and poor sleep. The healer's quarters were tucked into a quiet corner of the compound, filled with the earthy scent of dried herbs and the soft glow of candlelight. Mabel, an elderly woman with silver hair pulled into a loose braid, and eyes that seemed to see far more than they let on, looked up from her work as Lyra entered. "Come in, child," Mabel said, her voice warm in a way that Lyra had not heard from anyone else in the compound. "Sit, let me look at you." Lyra sat on a low stool near the fire, and Mabel studied her for a long moment, her sharp eyes moving over Lyra's face, her hands, the faint shadows beneath her eyes. "You're not sleeping," Mabel observed. "No," Lyra admitted. "And you're carrying something heavy," Mabel continued. "Something beyond exhaustion and headaches." Lyra hesitated, unsure how much to share with a woman she had only just met. But there was something in Mabel's gaze, a quiet steadiness, that reminded her, oddly, of the way she tried to hold herself in front of the pack. It made her feel, for the first time since arriving at Blackthorn, that she might be truly seen. "There's a feeling," Lyra said slowly, "that comes over me sometimes. A coldness beneath my skin. It happens when I'm afraid, or angry, or overwhelmed. I don't know what it means." Mabel's expression shifted, something sharpening behind her eyes, though her voice remained calm and even. "Show me your wrist," she said. Confused, Lyra held out her arm. Mabel took it gently, turning it over to examine the pale skin of her inner wrist beneath the dim candlelight. There, faint enough that Lyra had never paid it much attention, was a small, silvery marking, shaped like a crescent moon, wrapped around a single star. I've had this since I was born, Lyra said. My mother always said it was just a birthmark. Mabel was quiet for a long moment, her thumb tracing gently over the marking, her expression unreadable. When she finally spoke, her voice had dropped to barely above a whisper. This is not a birthmark, she said. This is a bloodline marking. I have only seen it once before, in an old text passed down through generations of healers, describing wolves so rare that most believe them extinct. Lyra's heart began to pound. What kind of wolves? Mabel glanced toward the door, as though making certain they were truly alone, before answering. The silver wolves, she said, guardians bound to the moon itself, said to awaken only in times of great need, when the world requires more strength than an ordinary wolf can offer. She looked back at Lyra, her eyes filled with something between wonder and worry. If this marking is real, child, then you are not wolfless. You are something far rarer, and far more dangerous than anyone in this pack could imagine. Lyra sat in stunned silence, the cold sensation beneath her skin stirring once more, as though responding to Mabel's words. You cannot tell anyone, Mabel said firmly, gripping Lyra's wrist a little tighter. Not the other servants, not Cain, and certainly not the Alpha. If word spreads that you carry this bloodline, there are those who would seek to use you, or worse, seek to destroy you, before you ever have the chance to understand your own power. Why would anyone want to destroy me? Lyra asked, her voice barely steady. Because power like this does not stay hidden forever, Mabel said quietly. And there are wolves in this world, child, who fear what they cannot control far more than they fear what they can. Lyra looked down at the small silver marking on her wrist, the one she had carried her entire life, without understanding its true meaning. Outside, the moon had begun to rise over the Blackthorn compound, pale and full, casting silver light through the healer's window. For the first time since arriving at this cold, unwelcoming place, Lyra felt something other than fear stirring inside her chest. She felt the faintest, quietest whisper of hope. She did not know yet what it truly meant to carry the blood of the silver wolves. She did not know how much pain still lay ahead of her, how many more insults she would have to endure, how many more nights she would spend alone in that narrow room, while the pack around her continued to see her as nothing more than a burden forced upon their unwilling king. But as she walked back to her quarters that night, beneath a moon that seemed, for the first time, to be watching her with something like recognition, Lyra Ashford allowed herself to believe, just a little, that she was not as weak as they all thought her to be. Somewhere deep within her, something ancient had begun, at last, to wake. 3 weeks had passed since Lyra first learned the truth about the marking on her wrist, and in that time, she had grown skilled at hiding it. Long sleeves became her constant companion, even as the days grew warmer. She kept her voice steady, her expression calm, and her eyes lowered whenever Draven Blackthorn happened to pass through the parts of the compound where servants were permitted to work. She saw him rarely, and when she did, he never looked at her directly. It was as though he had already decided she did not matter enough to warrant his attention, and having made that decision, he saw no reason to revisit it. Lyra told herself this suited her perfectly. The less he noticed her, the safer her secret remained. But safety, she was learning, was a fragile thing in a place like Blackthorn. It began on an ordinary afternoon, the kind that blurred easily into all the others. Lyra had been sent to the eastern storerooms to help catalog supplies ahead of the coming season, a task that kept her away from the busier parts of the compound. She welcomed the solitude. It gave her time to think, to breathe, to let her guard down just slightly, in a place where nobody was watching. She did not notice the 2 pack members following her, until it was too late. "Look who wandered off alone," came a voice from behind her, low and mocking. Lyra turned to find Edwin, the broad-shouldered man from the kennels, standing in the doorway of the storeroom, blocking her exit. Beside him stood a younger wolf named Perry, his arms crossed, a cruel smile tugging at his mouth. "I'm just finishing the inventory," Lyra said carefully, keeping her voice steady, despite the sudden tightening in her chest. "I'll be out of your way soon." "No rush," Edwin said, stepping further into the room. "We've been wanting a word with you, actually. Alone, since you're always hiding behind that healer, or scrubbing floors where nobody can get near you." Lyra's pulse quickened, though she forced herself to keep her expression neutral. "I don't know what you want from me." "We want to know the truth," Perry said, moving to block the other side of the room. Everyone talks about how strange you are, how you never shift, how you flinch at shadows. Some of us think you're not even a real wolf at all. Some of us think you're something worse. That's ridiculous, Lyra said, though her voice wavered slightly. Edwin took another step closer, his expression hardening. Is it? Because I've heard you sneaking off to see the healer late at night. I've seen the way you hide your wrists under those sleeves, even when it's warm enough to roast a boar out there. His eyes narrowed. What are you hiding, Ashford? Lyra's heart pounded against her ribs. She glanced toward the door, calculating the distance, the odds of slipping past them, but Perry had already moved to cut off her path entirely. I'm not hiding anything, she said, though even to her own ears, the words sounded unconvincing. Show us your wrist, then, Edwin said, reaching out toward her arm. Fear surged through Lyra's body, sharp and immediate, and with it came the familiar cold sensation beneath her skin, stronger now than it had ever been before. It rushed through her veins like ice water, gathering at her fingertips, humming with a strange, dangerous energy that made her ears ring. Don't touch me, she said, her voice suddenly sharper, edged with something that surprised even her. Edwin paused, some primal instinct making him hesitate for just a moment, but Perry laughed, unbothered, and grabbed for her arm from the other side. What happened next occurred so quickly that Lyra herself struggled to understand it. The moment his fingers closed around her wrist, a wave of cold energy pulsed outward from her skin, invisible but undeniable, like a gust of wind carrying the chill of deep winter. Perry stumbled backward with a sharp cry, clutching his hand, as though he had touched something burning cold rather than merely gripped an arm. What was that? He gasped, staring at his palm in shock. Edwin's eyes widened, his earlier bravado replaced by something closer to genuine alarm. He took a step back, his gaze fixed on Lyra, with a mixture of fear and suspicion. Lyra stood frozen, breathing hard, her own heart hammering with confusion and fear at what had just happened. She did not understand it herself. She only knew that whatever lived beneath her skin had reacted to protect her, and that reaction had been powerful enough to send a grown wolf stumbling backward in pain. Stay away from me, she said, her voice trembling now, though whether from fear or something else entirely, she could not say. Neither Edwin nor Perry argued. They backed out of the storeroom quickly, throwing wary glances over their shoulders as they went, and Lyra was left alone, staring down at her own hands as though they belonged to a stranger. She found Mabel that same evening, slipping into the healer's quarters, just as the last light of day faded from the sky. Something happened, Lyra said, her voice barely steady, as she recounted the incident in the storeroom. Mabel listened in silence, her expression growing more serious with every word, until finally she reached out and took Lyra's hands in her own, examining them closely, as though searching for some visible sign of what had occurred. This is happening faster than I expected, Mabel murmured, almost to herself. What is, Lyra asked, what is happening to me? Mabel released her hands and sat back, considering her words carefully before speaking. The blood of the silver wolves does not simply appear one day, fully formed, she explained. It stirs slowly, growing stronger, as the one who carries it faces greater trials. Fear, danger, moments where survival itself is uncertain. These things wake the power hidden inside you, little by little, until eventually, it can no longer stay contained. So it's growing, Lyra said quietly. Yes, Mabel said, and that means you must be more careful than ever. What happened today was small, a flicker rather than a flame. But if it continues to grow unchecked, and if the wrong people notice, the danger to you will only increase. Lyra thought of Edwin's face, pale with shock, and Perry's cry of pain as he stumbled backward. They already noticed, she said. They'll talk. Word will spread. Mabel's expression grew grim. Then we must hope word spreads slowly, and that those who hear it dismiss it as imagination or exaggeration, at least for now. But word, as it turned out, did not spread slowly at all. 2 days later, Lyra was summoned to Kane's office, a stark, functional room near the PAC's training grounds, filled with maps and ledgers and the faint smell of leather and steel. Kane sat behind his desk, his sharp eyes studying her the moment she stepped through the door, and Lyra knew immediately that something had changed. There's a rumor going around, Kane said without preamble. That you attacked 2 pack members in the storeroom 2 days ago. I didn't attack anyone, Lyra said carefully. One of them grabbed my wrist, and I pulled away. That's all that happened. Kane's gaze remained fixed on her, assessing, unreadable. Edwin claims you burned him. Says his hand was numb for hours afterward. Lyra's stomach tightened, but she kept her expression carefully neutral. I don't know what he felt. I only know I didn't want to be touched, and I made that clear. For a long moment, Kane said nothing, simply studying her with an intensity that made her want to look away, though she forced herself to hold his gaze. Finally, he leaned back in his chair, some of the tension easing from his shoulders, though his eyes remained sharp. I don't know what's true and what's exaggeration, he said, but I'd advise you to keep your distance from Edwin and his friends going forward. Whatever happened in that storeroom, it stirred up talk I don't need right now, not with tensions rising along the eastern border. The eastern border? Lyra asked, seizing the chance to shift the conversation away from herself. Kane's expression darkened slightly. Duskmoon Clan, he said. They've been testing our patrols, pushing further into contested territory than they have in years. Alpha Vorin has never made peace with our pack, not truly, and lately, he's grown bolder. Lyra had heard fragments of this before, whispered conversations among the servants about tension building beyond the borders of Blackthorn territory, but she had not realized how serious the situation had become. Is war coming? She asked quietly. That's not something you need to concern yourself with, Kane said, his tone closing the subject as firmly as a shutting door. Your concern should be staying out of trouble and staying out of sight. Understood? Lyra nodded, though something in her chest tightened at the dismissal, a familiar sting of being seen as nothing more than an inconvenience to be managed. Understood, she said. As she left Kane's office, she found herself thinking not of Edwin's accusations or the strange power stirring within her, but of the growing threat gathering beyond the borders of the only place she now called home, however unwelcoming it remained. She thought of the pack members who mocked her, the Alpha who had dismissed her without a second glance, and wondered, not for the first time, what would happen to all of them if war truly came, and what role, if any, she might be forced to play in it. That night, as she lay awake in her narrow cot listening to the distant howls of wolves patrolling the borders, Lyra pressed her palm against her chest, feeling the faint, steady hum of the strange power still simmering beneath her skin. She did not yet understand what she was becoming, but she understood, with growing certainty, that whatever it would not stay hidden forever. And somewhere beyond the safety of the compound walls, in the darkness of contested territory, an enemy was already sharpening his claws, preparing for a war that would soon change everything Lyra Ashford thought she knew about herself, about her place in this pack, and about the true cost of being underestimated by those who should have known better. The Border Patrol found the first sign of trouble just before dawn, a torn fence line and the unmistakable scent of unfamiliar wolves lingering in the frost-covered grass. By the time the news reached the main compound, the entire pack had shifted into a state of quiet, controlled alarm, the kind that came from wolves who had faced war before and knew exactly how quickly peace could shatter. Lyra heard about it from Grace, who arrived at the servants' quarters that morning with her usual calm expression, replaced by something tighter, more anxious. Duskmoon crossed the line last night, Grace said, keeping her voice low, even though they were alone. Not an attack, not yet, but close enough to it. Kane's doubled the patrols, the Alphas called an emergency council. Lyra felt a chill settle over her that had nothing to do with the strange power stirring beneath her skin. What does that mean for the pack? It means things are about to get worse before they get better, Grace said grimly. Vorin's been waiting for an excuse to push into our territory for years. Some say he wants the mining routes along the eastern ridge. Others say he just wants to prove Blackthorn is weaker than it used to be. Is it? Lyra asked. Weaker, I mean. Grace hesitated, glancing toward the door, as though worried someone might overhear, even though the corridor outside stood empty. The old Alpha, Draven's father, kept peace, through fear and respect both. Draven's still proving himself. Some of the older wolves in neighboring packs think that makes us vulnerable. She shook her head. I probably shouldn't be saying any of this. You can trust me, Lyra said quietly, and found, somewhat to her own surprise, that she meant it. Grace studied her for a long moment, something searching in her gaze, before giving a small, tired smile. "I know," she said. "That's the strange thing. Out of everyone in this compound, you're the one person I actually trust." The days that followed brought a tension to the compound that Lyra had never felt before. Patrols moved in and out of the gates at all hours. Warriors sharpened blades and checked armor with grim efficiency, and the easy chatter that usually filled the kitchens and courtyards during mealtimes fell into an uneasy quiet. Even the children of the pack, usually loud and carefree as they played near the training grounds, seemed to sense the shift in the air, growing subdued and watchful in ways children should never have to be. Lyra continued her work among the servants, though she found herself increasingly drawn toward the edges of the compound, watching the warriors train, listening to fragments of conversation about troop movements and border skirmishes, trying to understand the shape of the danger closing in around them all. It was during one such afternoon, while carrying water toward the training grounds, that she caught her first real glimpse of Draven since the night of her arrival. He stood near the center of the training yard, stripped of the formal robes he had worn that first evening, dressed instead in simple training clothes that did little to hide the raw strength of his build. He moved through combat drills with a precision that was almost hypnotic to watch, each strike measured and deliberate, each movement carrying the quiet confidence of someone who had spent his entire life preparing for exactly this kind of danger. Lyra told herself she should look away, should continue with her task, and avoid drawing his attention, but something kept her rooted in place for a moment longer than she intended, watching the Alpha King move through his drills with an intensity that seemed to carry the weight of the entire pack's survival on his shoulders. As if sensing her gaze, Draven suddenly turned, his eyes locking onto hers across the training yard. For a brief, charged moment, neither of them moved. Lyra's breath caught in her throat, uncertain whether to look away or hold his gaze, uncertain what expression crossed his face, whether it was irritation or something else entirely. Then Kane appeared at his side, breaking the moment with a report about patrol positions, and Draven's attention shifted away from her as quickly as it had arrived, as though she had never caught his eye at all. Lyra continued on her way, her pulse still unsteady, telling herself the reaction meant nothing beyond simple nerves at being noticed by a man who had already made his contempt for her so publicly clear. That evening, gathered near the kitchen fire with Grace and a few of the other servants, Lyra listened as conversation turned, once again, toward the growing threat from Duskmoon. "They say Voran's gathering allies," said an older woman named Clara, who had served the Blackthorn kitchens for as long as anyone could remember. "Packs from the northern territories, wolves who've never liked how much land Blackthorn controls. If it comes to war, we might be facing more than just Duskmoon alone." "The Alpha won't let that happen," said a younger servant, though his voice carried more hope than certainty. "The Alpha's young," Clara said, not unkindly, but with the weary honesty of someone who had seen too many seasons pass to sugarcoat difficult truths. "Strong, yes, and smart in his own way, but young. His father would have crushed this threat before it ever reached our borders. Draven's still learning how to wear that crown." Lyra listened quietly, absorbing every word, feeling the weight of the pack's uncertainty settle over her like a second skin. She thought of the strange power stirring beneath her own, of Mabel's warning that it grew stronger with fear and danger, and wondered, with a mixture of dread and something she did not yet want to name, whether the coming days might force that power to reveal itself far sooner than she was ready for. She did not have to wait long to find out. 3 nights later, the first real attack came. Lyra woke to the sound of horns blaring across the compound, sharp and urgent, followed by shouts and the thunder of running feet. She scrambled from her cot, heart pounding, and rushed to the small window of her room, watching as warriors streamed across the courtyard below, weapons drawn, faces set with grim determination.
"They're attacking the eastern village,"
she heard someone shout from below. Duskmoon wolves, dozens of them. They hit just after moonrise. The eastern village, Lyra knew, was a small settlement just beyond the main compound walls, home to elderly pack members and young families who lived under Blackthorn's protection, but outside its heaviest defenses. Panic surged through her chest as she thought of the children who lived there, the same children who had grown quiet and watchful in recent days, sensing a danger they could not yet fully understand. Without fully deciding to do so, Lyra found herself pulling on her boots, grabbing a cloak against the night chill, and slipping out of her room into the chaos of the courtyard. She did not know what she intended to do. She only knew that she could not stay locked away in her small room while innocent people faced danger just beyond the walls. She found Grace near the healer's quarters, already gathering supplies, her face pale but focused. "They'll need help treating the wounded," Grace said the moment she saw Lyra, not questioning why she had come. "Can you carry supplies? I need extra hands." "Yes," Lyra said immediately, grateful for a task that gave purpose to the fear coursing through her veins. Together, they made their way toward the gates, joining a small group of healers and support staff mobilizing to assist the warriors already rushing toward the eastern village. The night air was thick with tension, the distant sound of fighting carrying faintly on the wind, punctuated by the occasional flash of movement in the darkness beyond the compound walls. As they approached the outer edges of the village, the scene that greeted them was one of chaos. Buildings had been damaged, smoke curled into the night sky from a fire someone was already working to extinguish, and warriors clashed in the shadows, the sounds of snarling and combat echoing between the narrow streets. Lyra's stomach twisted as she caught sight of a group of children huddled near the remains of a collapsed fence, too frightened to move, too far from safety to reach it on their own. A dusk moon wolf, larger and more menacing than anything Lyra had ever seen up close, prowled toward them through the smoke, clearly having broken away from the main fighting to pursue easier targets. "Grace, the children," Lyra said urgently, already moving, before she had fully decided to do so. "Lyra, wait," Grace called after her, but Lyra was already running, driven by a fear more powerful than anything she had felt before. A fear not for herself, but for the small, terrified faces she could see clearly now in the flickering firelight. The dusk moon wolf turned toward her as she approached, sensing new prey, its eyes gleaming with predatory hunger in the darkness. Lyra's heart hammered against her ribs, every instinct screaming at her to run, but she forced herself to plant her feet between the wolf and the children, spreading her arms wide as though her small frame could somehow shield them from danger. "Get away from them," she said, her voice trembling but firm. The wolf let out a low, threatening growl, clearly unimpressed by her attempt at defiance, and began to advance. And then, for the first time in her entire life, the cold sensation beneath Lyra's skin did not simply flicker. It ignited. A pulse of energy rippled outward from her body, silver and cold, visible this time as a faint shimmer in the smoke-filled air. The dusk moon wolf recoiled with a startled snarl, its advance halted by something it could not name, something ancient and powerful, radiating from the small, trembling woman standing between it and its intended prey. Lyra felt her body change before she understood what was happening. Bones shifted beneath her skin, not with the pain she had always heard shifting described, but with a strange, fluid grace, as though her body had simply been waiting for permission to become what it was always meant to be. Her vision sharpened, colors deepening, sounds becoming clearer, and when she looked down at her own hands, she saw not human fingers but silver-tipped paws pressed against the scorched earth. She had become a wolf. Not just any wolf, but something larger, more radiant, than anything the Blackthorn pack had seen in generations, her fur a shimmering silver that seemed to catch and hold the moonlight itself, glowing faintly, even in the smoke-darkened night. The dusk moon wolf, sensing the shift in power, took a hesitant step backward, its earlier confidence replaced by something closer to primal fear. Lyra did not think. She acted on pure instinct, lunging forward with a speed and strength that felt both foreign and completely natural, driving the attacking wolf back from the terrified children with a series of swift, controlled movements that spoke of power she had never known she possessed. The dusk moon wolf snarled and snapped, attempting to hold its ground, but against the radiant silver force now standing before it, its efforts proved useless. Within moments, it turned and fled into the darkness, disappearing back toward the border it had crossed only hours before. Lyra stood over the children, her chest heaving, her new form still humming with residual power, and for a long moment, silence stretched across the smoke-filled village square. Then, slowly, warriors and villagers alike began to notice her, drawn by the fading commotion, and one by one, their eyes widened in shock at the sight before them. A murmur spread through the gathering crowd, disbelief mixing with awe. "Silver," someone whispered, "a silver wolf." Lyra shifted back to her human form, almost as quickly as she had transformed, the sudden absence of that immense power, leaving her feeling shaky and disoriented. She knelt beside the children, checking that they remained unharmed, her hands trembling now not with fear, but with the aftershock of everything that had just happened. It was then that she felt his presence before she saw him. Draven Blackthorn stood at the edge of the square, his warriors gathered around him, his eyes fixed on Lyra with an expression she had never seen him wear before. Gone was the cold dismissal, the casual contempt that had defined every previous interaction between them. In its place was something closer to shock, disbelief warring with a dawning realization that seemed to shake him to his core. "Lyra," he said, her name sounding strange on his lips, as though he had never truly used it before. He crossed the square toward her, his warriors parting to let him through, and knelt beside her, his eyes moving over her face, as though searching for some explanation to what he had just witnessed. "That was you." It was not quite a question, but Lyra answered it anyway. "Yes," she said quietly. "You're a silver wolf," he said, his voice barely above a whisper, filled with something that sounded almost like awe. "I thought they were extinct. I thought they were only stories." "So did I," Lyra admitted, her own voice unsteady. "Until very recently." Around them, the wounded were being tended, the fire finally brought under control, and the immediate danger of the attack had passed, though the deeper implications of what had just happened hung heavy in the smoke-filled air. Draven remained kneeling beside her, his gaze still fixed on her face, and for the first time since her arrival, Lyra saw something in his expression that was not contempt or dismissal, but genuine, unguarded astonishment. "I called you weak," he said quietly, almost to himself. "In front of my entire pack." "You did," Lyra agreed, unable to keep a faint edge from her voice. Draven's jaw tightened, something complicated passing behind his eyes, but before he could respond further, Cain approached, his own expression a mixture of shock and urgency. "Alpha, we need to assess the damage and secure the perimeter," Cain said. "Duskmoon may try another push before dawn." Draven rose slowly, his eyes lingering on Lyra for one more moment before turning to address his beta. "Double the eastern patrols," he said, "and make sure every wolf in this pack understands what happened here tonight." He glanced back at Lyra one final time before moving to follow Cain, leaving her kneeling in the scorched village square, surrounded by children she had just saved, and a pack that would never look at her the same way again. Grace found her moments later, pulling her into a tight, relieved embrace, before pulling back to study her with wide, astonished eyes. "You're a silver wolf," she said, echoing Draven's earlier words, disbelief and excitement mingling in her voice. "Lyra, do you understand what this means?" Lyra shook her head slowly, still trying to process everything that had happened in the span of only a few chaotic minutes. "I don't know what it means," she admitted. "I only know that I couldn't let that wolf hurt those children." "It means everything is about to change," Grace said, glancing around at the murmuring crowd still gathered in the square, their eyes fixed on Lyra, with expressions ranging from awe to uncertainty. "For you, and for this entire pack." As dawn began to break over the Blackthorn territory, painting the sky in soft shades of gold and pink, Lyra found herself standing at the edge of the village, watching as warriors worked to repair the damage from the night's attack. The strange, cold sensation beneath her skin had settled into something quieter now, a steady hum rather than an overwhelming surge, as though her body had finally found some measure of peace with the power it now carried openly. She thought of Draven's face as he knelt beside her, the shock and awe replacing the contempt she had grown so accustomed to seeing. She thought of the whispers already spreading through the pack, transforming her from an object of ridicule into something else entirely, something the wolves around her did not yet know how to categorize. She did not know what the coming days would bring. She did not know whether her newfound power would earn her respect or simply paint a larger target on her back, both from those within Blackthorn who resented her sudden change in status, and from enemies beyond the border who might now see her as a prize worth capturing rather than a burden to be dismissed. But as she watched the sun rise fully over the territory she had, against all odds, begun to call home, Lyra Ashford allowed herself, for the first time since her arrival, to stand a little taller, to breathe a little easier, and to believe, with quiet but growing certainty, that whatever came next, she would face it, not as someone weak and forgotten, but as exactly what she had always been beneath the surface. Something rare, something powerful, something that could no longer be ignored. News of what had happened in the Eastern Village spread through the Blackthorn compound faster than any wildfire. By midday, every servant, every warrior, every member of the pack seemed to know the story of the wolfless bride, who had turned out to be something far rarer than anyone had imagined. The whispers that had once dripped with mockery now carried a different tone entirely, uncertain, curious, some even tinged with something close to reverence. Lyra found the sudden shift unsettling. For weeks, she had grown accustomed to being overlooked, dismissed, treated as an inconvenience to be tolerated, rather than a person to be respected. Now, wherever she walked through the compound, eyes followed her, conversations quieted, and she caught fragments of her own name spoken in tones that ranged from awe to wariness. It was, in its own strange way, almost as isolating as the contempt had been. She retreated to the healer's quarters that afternoon, seeking the one place in the compound where she still felt something close to normal. Mabel greeted her with a knowing look, gesturing for her to sit near the fire. "I imagine the last day has been overwhelming," Mabel said, setting aside the herbs she had been sorting. "I don't know how to feel," Lyra admitted, sinking onto the low stool she had come to think of as her own. "Yesterday, I was invisible. Today everyone stares at me like I'm either a miracle or a threat. Perhaps you are both, in their eyes," Mabel said gently. "Power like yours does not fit neatly into the categories people are used to. Some will fear it. Some will try to use it. A rare few will simply respect it for what it is." She studied Lyra carefully. "How do you feel, truly, beyond what others think of you?" Lyra considered the question for a long moment. "Stronger," she said finally, "but also more exposed. Like I've finally found a piece of myself I didn't know was missing, but now everyone else wants a piece of it too." Mabel nodded slowly, understanding evident in her expression. That is often the price of power revealed too suddenly. You will need to learn control, not just of your shift, but of what you allow others to take from you. Strength without boundaries becomes a resource for others to exploit. Their conversation was interrupted by a soft knock at the door. Grace entered, her expression carrying a seriousness that immediately put Lyra on alert. "The Alpha wants to see you," Grace said. "In his private study, he asked that you come alone." Lyra's stomach tightened with uncertainty as she made her way through the compound toward Draven's private study, a part of the fortress she had never before been permitted to enter. The corridors here were quieter, lined with portraits of past Alphas, their painted eyes seeming to follow her as she passed. She found Draven standing near a large window overlooking the training grounds, his back to the door, his shoulders carrying a tension she had not noticed before. He turned as she entered, and for a moment, neither of them spoke, the events of the previous night hanging heavy in the air between them. "Thank you for coming," he said finally, his voice quieter than she had ever heard it, stripped of the cold authority he usually wore like armor. "You asked, and I imagine refusing would not have gone well for me," Lyra said, unable to keep a faint edge of wariness from her tone. Draven's expression flickered with something like discomfort. "I deserve that," he admitted. "I deserve considerably more than that, actually." He gestured toward a chair near his desk, though Lyra remained standing, unwilling to fully lower her guard. He seemed to accept this without argument, running a hand through his hair before continuing. "What I said to you, the night you arrived, in front of the entire pack, it was cruel, it was unfair, and it was wrong." Lyra said nothing, watching him carefully, waiting to see where this unexpected admission might lead. "I judged you before I knew anything about you," Draven continued, his voice growing more steady as he spoke, though the words themselves seemed to cost him something. "I saw someone small and unfamiliar, someone who didn't fit what I expected a mate to look like, and I let my own insecurities about proving myself as Alpha turn into cruelty toward you. That's not an excuse. It's simply the truth." "Your insecurities," Lyra repeated slowly. "About proving yourself." Draven's jaw tightened, but he did not look away. "My father built this pack into something feared and respected across every territory. When he died, and left me the crown, there were plenty of wolves, inside this pack and beyond it, who doubted I could hold what he built. When you arrived, weeks after Duskmoon began testing our borders, I saw an easy target for my own fear, rather than a person deserving basic respect. I let my need to appear strong in front of my pack come at your expense." He paused, his eyes finally meeting hers fully. "I am sorry, Lyra. Genuinely." The apology, unexpected as it was, did little to soften the weeks of humiliation and isolation Lyra had endured since her arrival. She studied him for a long moment, searching for insincerity, for some hidden motive behind the sudden change in his demeanor, but found only what appeared to be genuine regret. "An apology doesn't undo what happened," she said finally. "It doesn't undo the weeks I spent being mocked by your entire pack, or the nights I spent alone wondering if I'd ever be seen as anything other than a burden." "I know," Draven said quietly. "I'm not asking you to forget it. I'm only telling you that I understand now how wrong I was, and that going forward, you will be treated with the respect you deserved from the very beginning." Lyra crossed her arms, unwilling to let his words alone rebuild what his actions had so thoroughly damaged. "And what happens now? Now that your entire pack knows what I am, do I finally earn a place at your side now that I've proven useful enough to be worth your attention?" The question landed with visible weight, and Draven had the grace to look genuinely troubled by it. "That's not why I'm apologizing," he said. "Though I understand why you'd think that, given everything that's happened." He took a step closer, his expression earnest, in a way she had not seen from him before. "What you did last night, saving those children, standing against a Duskmoon wolf without hesitation, that showed me who you are, far more clearly than any bloodline marking could. I regret my cruelty because it was wrong, not because you've since proven yourself powerful." Lyra held his gaze, searching for the truth behind his words, uncertain whether she could fully trust the sudden shift in how he saw her. "I need time," she said finally. "Time to decide what any of this means, for me, and for whatever role you think I should play in this pack going forward." "That's fair," Draven said, nodding slowly. "Take whatever time you need. I won't push you toward anything you're not ready for." As Lyra turned to leave his study, he spoke once more, his voice quieter, almost hesitant. "For what it's worth," he said, "I am glad the council sent you here, even if I was too foolish to see it at the time." Lyra did not respond, though his words lingered with her long after she had left his study behind, carrying with them a complexity of emotion she was not yet ready to untangle. Anger and cautious hope tangled together in her chest, alongside a wariness that years of being underestimated had taught her to hold on to carefully. Over the following days, the change in how the pack treated her became increasingly evident. Servants who had once ignored her now greeted her with genuine warmth. Warriors who had laughed at Draven's mockery now nodded respectfully whenever she passed. Even Edwin, the man who had grabbed her wrist in the storeroom weeks earlier, approached her one afternoon with an awkward, stammering apology that Lyra accepted with more grace than he likely deserved. But not everyone within the pack greeted her transformation with warmth. She caught glimpses of resentment in certain eyes, wolves who had spent years working to earn their place within Blackthorn's ranks, now forced to watch as a woman they had dismissed weeks earlier rose to a status many of them would never achieve. Kane, in particular, remained cautiously distant, his sharp eyes tracking her movements with an assessment that had not fully softened, even as the rest of the pack embraced her newfound status. "You don't trust me," Lyra observed one afternoon, catching him watching her train with Mabel near the healer's quarters, practicing small, controlled bursts of the cold energy that lived beneath her skin. "I don't trust power I don't fully understand," Kane admitted honestly. "That's not personal, Ashford. That's simply how I've survived long enough to become beta of this pack." "Fair enough," Lyra said, and found, somewhat to her surprise, that she respected his honesty more than the sudden warmth from wolves who had mocked her only weeks before. Meanwhile, beyond the safety of Blackthorn's borders, word of the Silver Wolf's awakening had begun to travel further than anyone within the compound realized. In the shadowed halls of Duskmoon territory, Alpha Vorin received the news of his warrior's defeat with a stillness that unsettled even his most loyal advisors. "A silver wolf," Vorin repeated slowly, seated upon a throne, carved from darker, harsher stone than Blackthorn's, his eyes glinting with something dangerous and calculating. "Fighting for Blackthorn. The reports may be exaggerated," one advisor offered cautiously. "Or they may be entirely accurate," Vorin said, rising from his throne with slow, deliberate menace. "Do you understand what it would mean to command power like that, not merely to defeat Blackthorn, but to make every pack across these territories bow without question?" His eyes gleamed with dark ambition. Find out everything you can about this silver wolf. Her habits, her weaknesses, the people she cares about most. And once we know these things, Alpha. Voron's smile carried no warmth whatsoever. Then we take her, he said simply. Whether she comes willingly or not. Back within Blackthorn's walls, unaware of the dark ambitions now forming against her, Lyra continued her quiet work with Mabel, learning to control the power that had transformed her entire existence within the pack. She did not yet know that her newfound strength had drawn the attention of an enemy far more dangerous than mockery or dismissal, an enemy who saw in her not a person deserving of respect, but a weapon worth acquiring at any cost. For now, beneath the healer's watchful guidance and the growing, cautious respect of the pack around her, Lyra allowed herself the smallest measure of peace, unaware that the true test of her strength still lay ahead, closer than she could have imagined. 2 weeks passed in relative calm, though calm within Blackthorn territory had come to feel more like the stillness before a storm than genuine peace. Patrols continued their watchful vigil along the eastern border, and Lyra spent her days split between her ongoing training with Mabel and the small, careful steps she took toward rebuilding some semblance of trust with the pack around her. Draven kept his distance during this time, though not in the dismissive way he once had. Instead, his distance felt deliberate, almost respectful, as though he understood that trust could not be rebuilt through grand gestures, but only through the slow accumulation of small, consistent actions. He nodded to her when their paths crossed. He asked after her well-being when reports of her training reached his desk. He did not, however, push for more than she was ready to give, and Lyra found herself grudgingly grateful for the restraint. It was Grace who first noticed the change most clearly. "He asks about you," Grace said one evening, as the two of them sat near the kitchen fire, a habit that had become something of a nightly ritual between them, not in an official capacity either. Kane mentioned it to me, half annoyed about it actually. Says the Alpha keeps asking how your training progresses, whether you're settling in better, things that have nothing to do with pack business. That doesn't mean anything, Lyra said, though she felt an unfamiliar warmth rise in her chest at the words. Maybe not, Grace said, a knowing smile tugging at her lips. Or maybe the Alpha King is finally starting to see what the rest of us have known for weeks now. Lyra chose not to respond to that particular observation, though she found herself thinking about it more than she cared to admit in the days that followed. The fragile calm shattered on a moonless night nearly 3 weeks after the attack on the eastern village. Lyra woke to the sound of her door being forced open, the wood splintering under sudden, violent pressure. Before she could fully process what was happening, rough hands seized her. A cloth pressed firmly over her mouth and nose, and the world around her began to blur and darken at the edges. She fought back instinctively, the cold power beneath her skin flaring to life even through her disorientation. But whoever had come for her seemed prepared for exactly this reaction. A second figure moved quickly, pressing something cold and metallic against her wrist, and the moment it made contact with her skin, the familiar hum of her power fell suddenly, terrifyingly silent, as though something had reached inside her and simply switched it off. "Silverbane," she heard a rough voice mutter, satisfaction evident in the tone. "Works exactly like the old text described. Get her moving before the patrols circle back." Lyra's last coherent thought before darkness fully claimed her was of Draven's face, and a fierce, desperate hope that someone, anyone, would notice she was missing before it was too late. She woke sometime later in a dimly lit chamber that bore no resemblance to anywhere within Blackthorn territory. The walls were rough stone, damp with moisture, and a heavy iron band had been secured around her wrist, humming with the same strange energy that had silenced her power during the abduction. She tested its strength briefly, finding it unyielding, before turning her attention to her surroundings. The door to her chamber opened moments later, and a tall, imposing figure stepped through, his presence radiating a cold, calculating authority that immediately set every instinct in Lyra's body on high alert. "Alpha Voron," she said, recognizing him instantly from descriptions she had heard whispered throughout the Blackthorn compound. "You've heard of me," Voron said, seeming genuinely pleased by the recognition. "Good. That will save us both considerable time." He circled her slowly, studying her with the same assessing gaze a merchant might use when evaluating a particularly valuable acquisition. A silver wolf, fighting for Blackthorn. Do you have any idea how rare a discovery like you truly is? I'm not a discovery, Lyra said, forcing steadiness into her voice, despite the fear coiling in her stomach. I'm not a possession for you to claim either. Voron's smile carried no warmth whatsoever. Everything becomes a possession eventually, for those strong enough to claim it, he said. That Silverbane cuff will keep your power contained for now, but I have advisors working on more permanent solutions. Once I understand how to properly harness what you carry, imagine what we could accomplish together. I would never help you, Lyra said firmly. Not willingly, perhaps, Voron agreed, unbothered by her defiance. But willingness is a luxury I don't require. Given enough time and the right incentives, most creatures find ways to cooperate. His eyes glinted with something dangerous. And should Blackthorn come looking for you, which I fully expect they will, they'll find a fortress far better defended than that eastern village you so heroically saved. Let them come. Every wolf who falls trying to reclaim you only weakens Draven's position further. He left her alone after that, the heavy door sealing shut behind him, with a sound that echoed through the empty chamber like a judgment being passed. Lyra sank onto the cold stone floor, testing the cuff around her wrist once more, searching desperately for any flicker of the power that had always answered her call before. Nothing responded. The Silverbane held firm, leaving her feeling more human, more vulnerable, than she had felt since the night her power first awakened. She did not know how long she remained in that chamber, alone with her fear and her fury, before she forced herself to think clearly, rather than succumb to despair. Mabel had once told her that the power of the Silver Wolves answered fear and desperation, growing stronger, in moments when survival itself hung in the balance. Perhaps, Lyra reasoned, the Silverbane could suppress that power, but perhaps it could not fully extinguish it, not if she found a way to push hard enough against its constraints. She spent the following hours testing this theory in small, careful increments, focusing every ounce of will she possessed toward the cold sensation that had once lived so readily beneath her skin. Progress came slowly, painfully, each attempt leaving her exhausted and frustrated, but by the time exhaustion finally forced her into restless sleep, she was certain she had felt the faintest flicker of response, buried deep beneath the cuff's suppressing influence. Back within Blackthorn territory, chaos had erupted the moment Lyra's absence was discovered. Draven tore through the compound with a fury that sent even his most seasoned warriors scrambling to avoid his path, his fear for Lyra's safety manifesting as a barely controlled rage that Kane struggled to redirect toward productive action. The tracks lead east, toward Duskmoon territory, Kane reported grimly, having spent the early morning hours combing the compound and its surrounding area for any clue to Lyra's disappearance. Whoever took her knew exactly what they were doing. No wasted movement, no unnecessary noise. This wasn't opportunistic, it was planned. Voron, Draven said, the name coming out as barely more than a growl. It fits his pattern, Kane agreed. He's wanted an advantage over us for years. A silver wolf would give him exactly that, assuming he can find a way to control her. Draven's fists clenched at his sides, guilt and fury warring visibly across his features. I should have doubled her protection the moment her power revealed itself. I should have known an enemy like Voron wouldn't ignore an opportunity like this. Blaming yourself won't bring her back, Kane said, his tone firm but not unkind. Focusing our resources on getting her back will. Draven straightened, some of the raw panic in his expression hardening into cold, purposeful determination. Then let's focus, he said. Gather every warrior we can spare. We're going to Duskmoon territory, and we're bringing her home. The journey toward Duskmoon territory took the better part of 2 days, Draven pushing his warriors at a pace that left little room for rest, driven by a fear he did not fully allow himself to examine too closely. Kane rode beside him for much of the journey, offering steady counsel whenever Draven's frustration threatened to override careful strategy. Storming the front gates will only get our warriors killed, Kane pointed out during one of their brief stops to rest the horses. Voron will expect a direct assault. We need something he won't anticipate. I'm open to suggestions, Draven said tightly, his eyes fixed on the horizon, as though sheer will alone might close the remaining distance faster. It was Grace, who had insisted on joining the rescue party despite her limited combat training, who offered the idea that ultimately shaped their strategy. Lyra mentioned once that her power responds most strongly to fear and danger, she said. If she's being held somewhere secure, maybe the plan shouldn't be about breaking her out through force alone. Maybe it should be about creating a situation where her own power becomes the advantage, not just ours. Draven considered this carefully, a plan slowly forming in his mind. If we can create enough chaos within Duskmoon's walls, enough genuine danger, her power might break through whatever containment Vorin has placed on her. We wouldn't be trying to save her single-handedly. We'd be trying to give her the opportunity to save herself, with our support. That's a considerable risk, Kane said. Both for her, and for the warriors we send in. It's the risk we're taking either way, Draven said grimly. I'd rather give her a fighting chance than treat her as someone who needs rescuing without any agency of her own. The plan solidified over the remaining hours of their journey. A small group of warriors, including Draven and Kane, would infiltrate Duskmoon territory under cover of darkness, creating enough of a distraction to draw guards away from wherever Lyra was being held. The remaining forces would wait at the border, ready to provide reinforcement or cover a retreat, should the infiltration succeed or fail. Meanwhile, within the depths of Duskmoon's fortress, Lyra continued her quiet, determined work against the Silverbane Cuff, feeling the faintest traces of her power responding more readily with each passing hour, as though her body had begun to adapt to the suppression, finding small cracks in its containment. Vorin visited her chamber twice more during her captivity, each time probing for information about the extent of her abilities, each time growing visibly frustrated by her continued refusal to cooperate. You'll break eventually, he told her during his second visit, impatience beginning to show beneath his usual calculated composure. They always do. You clearly haven't met many silver wolves, Lyra replied, holding his gaze steadily, despite the exhaustion weighing on her body. Vorin's jaw tightened, but before he could respond further, a sharp commotion erupted somewhere beyond her chamber walls, shouts, and the sound of clashing steel, carrying faintly through the stone. His expression shifted immediately into sharp alertness. What is that? He demanded, though the question seemed directed more at himself than at her. He left the chamber quickly, and Lyra strained to make sense of the growing chaos beyond her door. Shouts grew louder, closer, and beneath the confusion, she caught the faintest, most welcome sound imaginable, Draven's voice, raised in command, unmistakable, even through layers of stone and distance. Hope surged through her chest, and with it, the power beneath her skin flared more strongly than it had since her captivity began, straining hard against the Silverbane's suppressing hold. She pressed her palm flat against the cuff, focusing every ounce of will and desperate hope into breaking its grip, and slowly, painfully, she felt the metal begin to weaken beneath the surge of her power. The chamber door burst open moments later, and Draven appeared in the doorway, breathing hard, his expression shifting from fierce determination to visible relief the moment his eyes found her. Lyra, he said, crossing the room quickly, his hands moving immediately to examine the cuff locked around her wrist. It suppresses my power, she explained quickly. I've been working to break it, but it's stubborn. Let me help, Draven said, and together, their combined effort finally cracked the ancient metal, the cuff falling away from her wrist with a final, satisfying snap. The moment it released, Lyra's power surged fully back into her veins, cold and radiant, and overwhelming in its sudden return. We need to move, Kane's voice called from the corridor beyond. Vorin's rallying his warriors. This isn't over yet. Draven helped Lyra to her feet, his hand lingering on hers a moment longer than strictly necessary. Can you fight? He asked, his eyes searching hers with genuine concern, rather than calculation. I can fight, Lyra confirmed, feeling her power settle into place beneath her skin, like an old friend finally returned home. They emerged from the chamber into a fortress, descending rapidly into chaos, Blackthorn warriors clashing with Duskmoon defenders throughout the narrow stone corridors. Vorin himself appeared at the far end of the hallway, flanked by several of his most loyal warriors, his expression carrying a fury that promised violence beyond what had already erupted around them. You dare invade my territory, Vorin snarled, his eyes fixing on Draven with pure hatred, before shifting toward Lyra, calculation flickering back into his gaze, despite the chaos surrounding him. And you? Did you truly think this rescue changes anything? I will simply take you again, as many times as it requires. You won't get the chance, Lyra said, stepping forward despite Draven's instinctive move to shield her. Vorin's lips curled into a cold smile. Confidence suits you, he said. Let's see if it survives contact with reality. He shifted then, his human form dissolving into a massive, dark-furred wolf, larger and more menacing than any Lyra had encountered before. His warriors followed suit, and within moments, the narrow corridor became a battleground of shifting shadows and gleaming teeth, the sounds of combat echoing off ancient stone walls. Lyra allowed her own shift to take hold, silver light rippling across her form as her wolf emerged once more, radiant and powerful, despite the exhaustion of her recent captivity. She moved to meet Vorin's advance, her earlier fear transformed into focused, controlled determination. The battle that followed tested every ounce of skill and power Lyra possessed. Vorin fought with brutal efficiency, his years of experience evident in every calculated strike, but Lyra countered with a combination of raw power and the careful discipline Mabel had helped her cultivate over the preceding weeks. Around them, Draven and Kain fought alongside their warriors, driving Duskmoon's remaining defenders back toward the fortress's outer walls. Vorin managed to land a heavy blow against Lyra's shoulder, staggering her momentarily, but she recovered quickly, channeling her pain into focused resolve rather than panic. She thought of the children she had saved in the eastern village, of Mabel's patient guidance, of the fragile trust she had begun rebuilding with the pack that had once mocked her so cruelly, and drew strength from all of it, pushing back against Vorin with renewed determination. The turning point came when Vorin, growing desperate as his forces began to falter around him, attempted a final, reckless lunge aimed directly at Lyra's throat. She anticipated the movement, years of careful observation and newfound instinct guiding her response, and sidestepped at the last possible moment, using his own momentum against him to drive him hard into the stone wall behind her. Vorin crumpled, momentarily stunned, and Lyra stood over him, her silver form radiant with power, restraint evident in every line of her posture, despite the ease with which she could have ended the confrontation entirely. "Yield!" she said, her voice carrying clearly through the chamber. "And this ends now, without further bloodshed." Vorin, defeated and finally recognizing the futility of continued resistance, gave a sharp, reluctant nod, and around the fortress, word spread quickly among his remaining warriors, the fighting gradually subsiding as Duskmoon's forces recognized their alpha's defeat. Draven appeared at Lyra's side moments later, his own battle-worn expression shifting into something close to wonder as he took in the scene before him. "You did it," he said quietly. "You actually did it." Lyra shifted back to her human form, exhaustion finally catching up with her, now that the immediate danger had passed. "We did it," she corrected, glancing toward him and the warriors who had risked everything to bring her home. Around them, Blackthorn warriors began securing the fortress, ensuring Vorin's surrender held firm, while Kain approached with a grim but satisfied expression. "Duskmoon's leadership will need to be restructured," he said. "But for now, the immediate threat has been neutralized." Draven turned back to Lyra, his expression carrying a warmth she had never before seen directed toward her. "You saved yourself," he said quietly. "You saved all of us, honestly. I owe you more than I can properly express." "You can start," Lyra said, managing a tired but genuine smile, despite the exhaustion weighing on her body, "by never underestimating me again." "I don't think that will be a problem," Draven said, and for the first time since her arrival at Blackthorn, his answering smile carried no trace of mockery or dismissal, only genuine, hard-earned respect. The journey back to Blackthorn territory felt entirely different from the desperate ride that had carried Draven and his warriors toward Duskmoon days earlier. Where fear and urgency had driven their initial pace, something closer to quiet celebration now settled over the returning group, warriors sharing stories of the battle already, their voices carrying a mixture of relief and pride that had been notably absent in recent weeks. Lyra rode near the front of the group, still recovering from the physical toll of her captivity and the battle that followed, but carrying herself with a new sense of settled confidence that had not been there when she first arrived at Blackthorn months earlier. Grace rode close beside her for much of the journey, occasionally reaching over to squeeze her hand, as though needing the physical reassurance that her friend had truly returned safely. "You know," Grace said during one quiet stretch of the journey, "when Kane told everyone you'd been taken, I've never seen the entire compound go so quiet, so fast. People who barely knew you were pacing the courtyard, waiting for news. I didn't realize I'd made that much of an impression," Lyra admitted. "You saved children from a dusk moon attack with your bare hands, essentially," Grace pointed out with a small laugh. "That tends to leave an impression." As they finally crossed back into familiar Blackthorn territory, word of their successful return had clearly traveled ahead of them, because the gates stood open, and much of the pack had gathered to welcome the returning warriors home. The reception that greeted Lyra as she dismounted was nothing like the cold, mocking silence that had met her upon her original arrival. Instead, she found herself surrounded by genuine warmth, pack members calling out relieved greetings, some even reaching to briefly clasp her hand or offer quiet words of gratitude for what she had endured and overcome. Mabel found her within the crowd, pulling her into a tight embrace that spoke more clearly than words ever could, of the worry she had carried during Lyra's absence. "You survived," Mabel said, pulling back to study her carefully, checking for any lingering injury with the practiced eye of a healer. "And your power, it held strong even against Silverbane?" "Barely," Lyra admitted, "but it held." "That tells me everything I need to know about how far you've come," Mabel said, satisfaction evident in her weathered features. Over the following weeks, life within Blackthorn territory settled into a new rhythm, one that bore little resemblance to the isolation and mockery Lyra had first endured upon her arrival. Word of the negotiated peace with Duskmoon spread throughout the pack, along with careful, closely monitored terms that ensured Voran's remaining influence could no longer threaten Blackthorn's borders as easily as before. The eastern villages began rebuilding what damage remained from the earlier attack, and slowly, steadily, a sense of security returned to the territory that had felt so precarious only months before. Lyra found her own place within this new rhythm gradually, no longer confined to the servants' quarters, but not yet fully settled into whatever role the pack expected a Silver Wolf mate to hold either. She continued her training with Mabel, growing more confident with each passing week in her ability to control the power that had once felt so overwhelming and unpredictable. She also found herself spending increasing amounts of time in Draven's company, their initial wariness slowly giving way to something warmer, built not on the desperation of their earlier rescue, but on the steady accumulation of small, genuine moments shared between them. "I used to think strength meant never showing weakness," Draven admitted to her one evening, as they walked together along the training grounds, the sun setting in soft shades of gold over the territory around them. "My father taught me that vulnerability was something enemies could exploit. I think that's part of why I reacted so harshly when you first arrived. I saw someone who seemed vulnerable, and some foolish part of me equated that with weakness worth mocking rather than protecting." "And now?" Lyra asked, watching him carefully. "Now I understand that the strongest wolf I've ever met walked into this compound, looking exactly like what I mistakenly called weak," Draven said quietly. "I was wrong about so much, Lyra. About you, about what strength truly means, about how I define worth within this pack." Lyra considered his words carefully, weighing them against the weeks of pain his initial cruelty had caused her, against the slow, careful trust she had rebuilt not just with him, but with herself and her own capabilities. "I'm not the same person who arrived here months ago," she said finally. "That woman would have accepted whatever role this pack decided to give her, quietly, without question. I'm not willing to do that anymore." "I wouldn't want you to," Draven said, turning to face her fully, his expression open and sincere, in a way she had never seen from him before. "I don't want a mate who simply accepts whatever place I offer her. I want someone who stands beside me as an equal, who challenges me when I'm wrong, who brings her own strength to this partnership, rather than simply borrowing mine." The following weeks brought further changes to the pack's structure, changes that reflected the growing respect Lyra had earned through both her power and her character. Draven began consulting her directly on matters of pack strategy, valuing her perspective not merely as a novelty, but as a genuine asset born of her unique insight and steady judgment. Kane, too, gradually warmed toward her, his earlier caution giving way to grudging, then genuine respect, as he watched her handle both power and responsibility with consistent integrity. I misjudged you, Kane admitted to her one afternoon, watching as she helped coordinate supply distributions for the still recovering eastern villages. I thought your power made you dangerous. I've come to understand that your character is what actually matters, and that character has proven far more valuable to this pack than raw power alone. Power without character is dangerous, Lyra agreed. I'm glad we agree on that much at least. As autumn deepened into winter, and the territory settled into the quiet rhythms of the changing season, the Blackthorn pack gathered once more, in the same great hall, where Lyra had first been so cruelly dismissed months earlier. This time, however, the atmosphere carried none of that earlier coldness. Instead, warmth and genuine celebration filled the space, as Draven formally acknowledged Lyra's role within the pack, not as a political obligation forced upon him by treaty, but as a partner he had chosen freely, with full understanding of exactly who she was and what she brought to their shared future. Months ago, Draven said, addressing the assembled pack with a steadiness that carried genuine emotion beneath its formal cadence, I made the grave mistake of judging this woman before I understood her true worth. I called her weak in front of all of you, and in doing so, I revealed my own limitations far more than I revealed anything true about her character. He turned to look at Lyra, standing beside him with quiet, dignified confidence. Lyra Ashford has since proven herself the strongest, most capable partner I could have ever hoped to find, not simply because of the rare power she carries, but because of the courage, integrity, and resilience she has shown time and again, even when this pack, and I especially, gave her every reason to give up on us entirely. A murmur of agreement rippled through the gathered crowd, genuine warmth replacing the mockery that had once filled this same hall. I stand before you today, Draven continued, not merely as your alpha, but as a man deeply grateful that this pack was given a second chance to know her true worth. Lyra Ashford is not simply my mate by treaty or obligation. She is my equal, my partner, and the woman I am proud to stand beside as we build this pack's future together. Lyra felt the weight of months of pain and struggle finally begin to ease as she looked out over the pack that had once dismissed her so completely, now offering genuine respect and welcome in its place. She thought of the frightened, uncertain woman who had first stumbled into this hall, humiliated and alone, and recognized how far she had traveled since that difficult beginning. I came to this pack as a stranger, Lyra said, addressing the gathered crowd with a steadiness that surprised even herself. I was mocked, dismissed, and made to feel as though I would never truly belong here. But I have learned, through everything that has happened since, that belonging isn't something given to you by others. It's something you build, through your own actions, your own choices, and your own refusal to let cruelty define your worth. She glanced toward Draven, warmth evident in her expression. I am proud to call Blackthorn my home now, not because it was forced upon me, but because I have chosen it, just as it has finally chosen to see me clearly. The celebration that followed carried long into the night, filled with laughter and warmth that stood in stark contrast to the cold reception Lyra had first received within these same walls. As the festivities continued around her, she found a quiet moment to step outside, drawn by the same full moon that had witnessed her first awakening months earlier. Draven joined her there, standing close beside her beneath the silver moonlight, and for a long moment, neither of them spoke, simply enjoying the quiet after months of turmoil and uncertainty. Do you regret any of it? Draven asked finally. Everything you endured to reach this point? Lyra considered the question carefully, thinking of the humiliation, the isolation, the fear, but also of the strength she had discovered within herself, the true friends she had gained, and the partnership she had built with a man who had once dismissed her so completely. No, she said finally, meeting his gaze with quiet certainty. Every difficult moment brought me here, to exactly where I'm meant to be. She looked up at the moon, feeling the familiar hum of power settled comfortably beneath her skin, no longer a mystery to fear, but a strength she had learned to embrace fully. I was never truly weak, Draven. I simply hadn't yet discovered what I was capable of becoming. Draven reached for her hand, lacing his fingers through hers beneath the silver light. I'm endlessly grateful the world gave me the chance to discover it alongside you, he said quietly. Together, they stood beneath the full moon, two people who had begun their journey through cruelty and misunderstanding, now bound by genuine respect, hard-earned trust, and a partnership built on the recognition that true strength had never been about the absence of vulnerability, but about the courage to rise, again and again, no matter how many times the world tried to convince you that you were less than you truly were. The Blackthorn pack, once divided by fear and old prejudice, now stood united behind a queen who had proven, beyond any doubt, that the rarest strength often hides beneath the surface, waiting patiently for the moment it is finally allowed to shine.